Welcome back to Core HTML Mastery. We're going to be talking about iframes in HTML. The simplest way of explaining an iframe is that it's a web page inside another web page. So we have that page, and inside that page we have a container, which is referred to as an iframe. And inside that frame, we load up a second website. Now, just to give an example of how this works, let's head on over to the zenshell.ninja site and let's head to the library section. Now you can see at the moment there's only one video course here. It's the Core CSS Mastery. Hopefully by the time you visit there'll be more video courses there, including this Core HTML Mastery course. Let's imagine we want to render this particular page as an iframe on our blank HTML page that we see on the screen right now. So looking at our HTML document, first of all, we make use of iframe tags. And very similar to an anchor tag, we have a source attribute. So we're going to specify http://www.zenshell.ninja/library. And let's close that iframe. And if we refresh the page, we see an iframe, kind of like a picture frame. And inside that, we have a version of the zenshell.ninja website. And you can see it's actually the mobile view. It's become narrower to fit within the size of the iframe. Now, this is not a very large iframe. What if we wanted to render the iframe so that the site was larger? Well, we can make use of width and height attributes on the iframe. So let's set width 600, and this is going to be a value that represents the number of pixels. Width 600, height, let's set it to 600 as well. And let's refresh the page. And you can see we get a much larger iframe. Now, similar to other width and height attributes, these aren't generally used by developers, and that's because we can make use of CSS to style the width and height of an iframe. If I was to click on a link inside the iframe, you can see it just loads up that link inside the iframe. So it's like we have a browser inside a browser. We can follow any of the links, and they're going to be loaded up inside that iframe. Now, just recapping on our directory structure to the left, we have a pages folder, and inside that we have a page2.html document. It just says welcome to page 2, and we can also use an iframe to navigate to a local HTML link. So in index.html, let's change the source now to pages/page2.html. Just a side note here, if you are working with Firefox, and this could be the same with other browsers, if I save the HTML and refresh the page, notice we still get zenshell.ninja. So what's going on there? For whatever reason, it seems if we change the source of an iframe, we may need to reopen the index.html, particularly if we're working like this. It could be different if this particular HTML is being rendered by a server, but we're just opening it in a browser. And you can see that change is not being reflected. So if we close this, reopen it with Firefox, and now we can see the correct document being rendered. Now this particular link returns back to index.html. So let's see what happens if we follow that. Well, we actually get an iframe inside an iframe, right? Because that iframe is originally on the index.html document. So you can see this is not really the kind of functionality that you'd want. But we basically have created some sort of loop here where we click on a page which loads an iframe that contains an iframe that can then load a page with an iframe. So you can see we can keep on loading iframes. Now that's mostly what you need to know about the technical aspect of how iframes work. There are additional attributes we can make use of. For example, if we head to the W3 docs, which is also an excellent resource. So we've made use of MDN web docs, but also W3 documentation is very good as well. If anything, the W3 documentation is a little bit more simple and straightforward, but doesn't necessarily include all of the features in its tutorials, but MDN Web Docs does, but it's more complex as a result. So we can see here the different attributes that we can make use of as part of an iframe tag. This really goes for any element we've looked at so far in the series. We may not have covered every single attribute. Some of them are not simply used very much. But if we want to know the full range of available attributes, we can check out W3 Docs, or we can check out the MDN Web Docs. For example here, this might be interesting, the loading attribute, and it specifies whether the iframe should be eager loaded or lazy loaded. So those are some terms you will hear in web development. So eager loaded Imagine we have an iframe that's at the bottom of a web page, and the user would technically have to scroll down before they could actually see that iframe. Well, should that iframe load, even though the user won't see that iframe until they scroll down? Or do we want the browser to only load that iframe when it comes into the viewport of the user? For example, the user has scrolled down. And you might think, well, why do we care about that? Well, imagine we had a page with 100 iframes. Hopefully not that we would. We wouldn't necessarily want them all to load on the initial page load, because that could have some performance issues. It could take a while for the page to actually load. But if instead, as the user scrolled down and the iframes came into the viewport, they loaded at that point, which is referred to as lazy loading, it's obviously going to help the performance of the site, but it might take a second or two to actually load once it comes into the user's viewport. So there are some other attributes we can make use of there. So check the W3 docs if you want to see the full range of different attributes we can use with an iframe. You might be left with one question, which is, what is the point of an iframe? Why not just link to page 2? Why have an iframe with page 2 inside the iframe? Now, we wouldn't generally use an iframe for this purpose, but the general applications of iframes are: one example is, imagine you make use of a video provider such as Vimeo, for example, and you want to embed one of your Vimeo videos in the page. Well, very often the code that you will use for that is going to be an iframe. So it's an iframe showing you part of the Vimeo site which contains your video, for example. So very often iframes are used for showing videos which are stored at a third party, but there are other applications as well. If you've ever visited a website and you see there's all of these ads popping up, well, very often those ads won't be hard-coded as part of the page. They will actually be inside an iframe, which is pointing to an external site, and the owners of that external site can then change the advertisement. Sometimes it may even change the advert depending on who the user is. But those ads are displayed in iframes because they're essentially not part of the page the user is on, but they're being loaded from an external source. Sometimes you've probably also had the experience where there's a large number of these iframe adverts and your entire page slows down. In fact, it gets to the point where sometimes the adverts are covering content, or the page becomes very slow and borderline unusable. So an important thing to keep in mind is there are performance implications on making use of iframes. You wouldn't want a page with too many iframes, otherwise it could slow the experience down for the end user. A final example could be a payment processor makes use of an iframe. And iframes don't necessarily have to appear on the page as a way of actually making them pop out. So for example, we click Pay Now on a certain site, and then an iframe pops up with a location for you to input your card details. And that pop-up is not necessarily hosted on the actual site we're making the purchase on. It's actually hosted on a third-party payment processor. And we have an iframe that pops up and is basically operating from the payment processor's servers. So just to recap, there's 3 examples there of when an iframe might be used. So it could be loading embedded video, could be advertisement content, and it could be making use of a third-party payment processor. The key takeaway from this video is just what an iframe is and the syntax for adding an iframe to the page. That's all we need to know right now. For your first few basic HTML projects, you probably won't be making use of iframes anyway, but if you are, then as you can see, the syntax is really quite basic. We just need an iframe and a source. We're able to render web content inside an iframe. Thanks very much for watching, guys. Catch you in the next part of the course.